The fishing village along the Nile celebrated when the temple priests arrived. Families lined up, pushing their daughters forward, hoping one would be selected. Being chosen as a sacred handmaiden of Isis was considered the highest honor a family could receive. The priests walked through the crowd, examining girls between 7 and 10 years old, checking their teeth, their skin, their bodies like livestock at market. 10-year-old Nefret stood among them, her mother gripping her shoulders with pride. When the priest stopped in front of her, running his fingers through her hair and lifting her chin to examine her face, her mother whispered prayers of gratitude. The priest marked Nefret's forehead with ochre. She was selected. Her mother wept with joy, believing her daughter would live a life of luxury and divine favor. What these families didn't know was that they were selling their daughters into a system designed to break them. The Temple of Isis in Thebes wasn't a place of worship. It was a carefully constructed machine that transformed children into instruments of priestly pleasure, all disguised under the veil of religious devotion. The selected girls were taken immediately. No goodbyes, no preparations. Nefret watched her village disappear as the boat carried her and 12 other girls down the Nile toward Thebes. The priests didn't speak to them during the journey. They simply watched, evaluating their new acquisitions with the cold assessment of men who'd done this hundreds of times before. When they arrived at the temple complex, the girls were separated and taken to underground chambers. Nefret was stripped naked by older women with dead eyes and vacant expressions. These were former sacred handmaidens, now too old or too damaged to serve their original purpose. They bathed Nefret in cold water mixed with natron, scrubbing her skin raw. Every part of her body was inspected, prodded, examined. She tried to cover herself, but the women slapped her hands away. The purification ceremony began that first night. Nefret and the other new girls were brought to a chamber lit by oil lamps. The walls were covered in hieroglyphs depicting Isis in various poses. The high priest entered wearing the ceremonial mask of Anubis. He explained that they were no longer children. They belonged to the goddess now. Their bodies were temples that needed consecration. What followed wasn't consecration. It was systematic assault disguised as religious ritual. Each girl was held down by the older handmaidens, while the priest performed what he called the opening of the sacred vessel. Nefret's screams echoed off the stone walls, mixing with the screams of the other girls. The older women held them firm, their faces showing no emotion, no compassion. They had learned long ago that resistance only made it worse. When it was over, Nefret lay bleeding on the cold stone floor. The priest told her she had been blessed by the goddess. The pain she felt was the goddess entering her body. She should be grateful. Around her, the other girls sobbed and whimpered. One had passed out entirely. Another vomited on the floor. The older handmaidens cleaned them up mechanically, like washing dishes after a meal. That first night, Nefret learned the fundamental truth of her new existence. The honor her mother had wept over was a death sentence. The divine favor was torture, and escape was impossible. The temple walls were high, the guards were everywhere, and even if she somehow made it out, where would she go? Her family had accepted payment for her. They believed she was serving the goddess. If she returned claiming otherwise, she'd be branded a liar and blasphemer. But the purification ceremony was just the beginning. What Nefret didn't know yet was that the priests had developed an entire system of breaking girls like her, transforming them from terrified children into compliant vessels. And that education was about to begin. The morning after the purification ceremony, Nefret could barely walk. The older handmaidens forced her and the other new girls out of their sleeping chambers before dawn. There was no sympathy, no comfort. One girl who couldn't stand was dragged by her arms across the stone floor. The handmaidens had learned their most important lesson well. Weakness would not be tolerated. The education began in a chamber the priests called the House of Transformation. The high priestess, a woman named Merit, who had served the temple for 30 years, explained the rules. The girls belonged to Isis now, Their bodies were instruments of divine communication. They would learn to endure, to perform, to serve without question. Failure meant punishment. Success meant survival. The training was methodical and brutal. Every morning started with physical conditioning designed to increase their pain tolerance. The girls were made to hold painful positions for hours, kneeling on rough stones until their knees bled, standing with arms extended while heavy stones were placed in their hands, crouching in positions that made their muscles scream. If they moved or cried out, they were beaten with reed switches. But the physical conditioning was nothing compared to what the priests called intimate preparation. Starting the second week, each girl was assigned to a specific priest for personal instruction. Nefret was given to a man named Panhesi, who explained that she needed to learn to accept the presence of the divine without resistance. What he meant was that she needed to be trained to endure sexual assault without fighting back. The sessions happened daily. Panhesi would use increasingly invasive methods, all while explaining that this was sacred preparation. He told Nefret that her body's resistance was evil, trying to prevent the goddess from entering her. When she cried, he said her tears were impurities being expelled. When she bled, he said it was proof the ritual was working. The psychological manipulation was as damaging as the physical violation. The priests had perfected this system over generations. They knew exactly how to break a child's will while making them believe their suffering had meaning. They used religious language to reframe abuse as blessing. They isolated the girls from each other, preventing them from forming bonds or comparing experiences. They created a hierarchy where older victims supervised newer ones, ensuring complicity through guilt and survival instinct. Nefret watched as girls who resisted too strongly simply disappeared. The priestess Myrti would announce that the goddess had rejected them, that they had been returned to their families in disgrace. But Nefret noticed that these disappearances always happened at night, and she never heard of anyone actually returning home. She began to suspect that rejection by the goddess meant something far more permanent. The psychological tactics were sophisticated. The priests alternated between brutality and kindness. After particularly violent sessions, Panhesi would give Nefret small gifts, a piece of honey cake, a pretty bead. He would stroke her hair gently and tell her she was doing well, that the goddess was pleased with her progress. This created a desperate attachment. Nefret found herself actually trying to please him, to earn those moments of gentleness, even though he was the source of her pain. By the third month, something inside Nefret had fundamentally changed. She no longer fought during the training sessions. She had learned to separate her mind from her body, to float somewhere above herself while terrible things happened below. The priests called this achievement enlightenment. In reality, it was dissociation, a psychological survival mechanism that would haunt her for whatever remained of her life. The other girls were changing too. Some became completely docile, their eyes empty and their movements mechanical. Others developed a desperate eagerness to please, competing for the priest's approval like starving dogs fighting for scraps. A few maintained a spark of defiance in their eyes, but Nefret noticed these were the ones who tended to disappear. The education phase lasted 6 months. During that time, Nefret was systematically conditioned to accept that her body existed solely for the use of the priests. She was taught elaborate rituals and procedures, all designed to make sexual exploitation seem like religious ceremony. She learned which herbs to chew to numb herself, which positions hurt less, which prayers to recite to make it end faster. By the time the high priest declared her education complete, Nefret barely recognized herself. The terrified 10-year-old who had arrived at the temple was gone. In her place was something else, not quite a person anymore, more like a vessel that had learned to survive by becoming exactly what her captors wanted her to be. But surviving the education meant she was now ready for her true purpose. And that purpose would make everything she had endured so far seem almost merciful by comparison. The ceremony happened on the night of the full moon, 6 months after Nefret arrived at the temple. She was 14 now, though she felt centuries older. The high priest announced that she and 3 other girls had completed their education. They would undergo the sacred marriage to Isis, becoming full handmaidens with all the privileges and duties that entailed. The girls were prepared in separate chambers by the older handmaidens. Nefret's body was covered in scented oils, and her skin painted with henna in intricate patterns. They dressed her in sheer linen that revealed more than it concealed, placed a heavy wig on her shaved head, and lined her eyes with kohl. When she looked at her reflection in the polished bronze mirror, she didn't recognize the person staring back. The ceremony took place in the inner sanctum, a chamber most temple visitors never saw. The walls were covered in explicit hieroglyphs showing Isis in union with various gods. A massive statue of the goddess dominated the room, her stone eyes seeming to watch everything. Incense burned in braziers, filling the air with smoke that made Nefret's head swim. She later learned the incense contained herbs that dulled pain and created a dreamlike state. The high priest entered wearing the mask of Osiris, Isis's divine husband. Behind him came 6 other priests, each wearing ceremonial masks. The message was clear. Tonight, these men would represent the gods themselves. What they did to the girls would be sacred union, not rape. The religious theater transformed brutality into blessing. Nefret was led to an altar in the center of the room. The high priest spoke in the ancient language, reciting prayers she had been taught to memorize but not understand. He explained to the assembled priests that these vessels were now ready to receive divine essence, that through them, the goddess would communicate her will and bestow her blessings on the faithful. What followed wasn't a ceremony. It was organized gang rape disguised as religious ritual. Each priest took his turn while the others watched and chanted. Nefret had been trained for this, had been conditioned to accept it, but nothing could have prepared her for the reality. The herbs in the incense helped, creating a fog between her mind and body. But she still felt everything. The pain, the humiliation, the absolute powerlessness. The worst part was that she couldn't even scream. She had been taught that crying out during sacred union was blasphemy against the goddess. Girls who screamed during their consecration were taken away and never seen again. So Nefret bit her tongue until it bled, channeling all her agony into silence while 7 men violated her in succession. The other 3 girls underwent the same ritual simultaneously on nearby altars. Nefret could hear their muffled whimpers, their breathing, their desperate attempts to stay silent. One girl, a 15-year-old named Takat, started crying audibly. The high priest stopped immediately and gestured to the guards. Takat was dragged from the altar, still crying, still bleeding. The ceremony continued without her, as if she had never existed. When it was over, hours later, Nefret lay on the cold stone altar unable to move. Her body was a map of pain. Blood ran down her thighs. The priests filed out, their religious duty completed. The older handmaidens entered and began cleaning the girls mechanically, washing away the evidence, preparing them for what came next. Because the consecration wasn't the end. It was the beginning. The high priest returned after the cleaning and explained what their new duties would entail. They were now official handmaidens of Isis. They would serve in the temple, performing sacred unions with worshippers who sought the goddess's blessing. Wealthy men would pay enormous sums to commune with the divine through them. This was their purpose. This was the honor their families had sold them into. Nefret was taken to new chambers, slightly larger than the education rooms, but still underground. She shared the space with 5 other consecrated handmaidens, all in various stages of damage. Some had been serving for years. Their bodies bore the marks of their service, scars, chronic pain, the hollow eyes of people who had learned to disappear inside themselves. That first night in the handmaiden quarters, an older girl named Nefret whispered the truth that no one else would say. Surviving the consecration meant entering a lifetime of sexual servitude. Most handmaidens lasted 5 to 8 years before their bodies broke down completely. Disease was common. Injuries were frequent. Death was often a mercy. Nefret learned that the girls who disappeared during training weren't sent home in disgrace. They were killed and buried in unmarked graves beneath the temple. The priests couldn't risk them telling the truth about what happened inside these walls. Silence was maintained through murder, and everyone who survived long enough to become a full handmaiden was complicit in that silence. But even knowing all this, even understanding the full horror of what her life had become, Nefret had no choice but to continue. The alternative was joining the girls in those unmarked graves, so she did what all the other handmaidens did. She learned to dissociate completely during the sacred unions. She learned which herbs dulled the pain and which ones prevented pregnancy. She learned to smile and perform, and pretend that being raped by strangers for money was actually divine service. The consecration had transformed her from a broken child into a functioning prostitute. And the system that had created her was just getting started with her destruction. The temple operated like a well-organized business. Wealthy merchants, foreign dignitaries, and Egyptian nobles paid massive sums for the privilege of communing with the goddess through her handmaidens. The priests marketed it perfectly. This wasn't prostitution. It was a sacred ritual that would bring fertility, prosperity, and divine favor. Men convinced themselves they were performing a religious duty, not buying access to teenage girls. Nefret's daily routine began before dawn. The handmaidens were bathed, perfumed, and prepared for service. They ate a small meal mixed with herbs that prevented pregnancy and numbed sensation. Then they were taken to the receiving chambers, elaborately decorated rooms where they would spend the next 12 to 14 hours receiving worshippers. The priests had established a system of tiers. Common men could purchase a brief encounter in the outer chambers for a modest fee. Wealthy merchants could reserve longer sessions in more private rooms. The truly rich could purchase an entire night, with multiple handmaidens in the luxurious inner sanctum. Every transaction was recorded, every payment collected, every session supervised by temple guards who ensured the worshippers didn't damage the merchandise too badly. Nefret served an average of 8 to 12 men per day. Each encounter followed the same ritual format. The man would make an offering to the statue of Isis. A priest would bless the union. Then Nefret would perform her duty, while the man convinced himself he was experiencing something sacred rather than simply raping a teenager he'd purchased. The physical toll was devastating. Within months, Nefret developed chronic pain that never fully disappeared. The herbs that prevented pregnancy caused other problems: irregular bleeding, stomach cramps, dizziness. Small tears and injuries never fully healed before being reopened. The temple physician, a man named Imhotep, treated the handmaidens like livestock. Patch them up enough to get back to work, but don't waste expensive medicine on anything that won't kill them immediately. But the physical damage was almost easier to bear than the psychological torture. Some men were violent, taking out their frustrations on girls who couldn't fight back. Others were disturbingly gentle, treating the encounter like an actual romantic liaison, which somehow felt worse. They would talk to Nefret, tell her their problems, ask about her feelings, all while participating in a system that had destroyed her childhood and would eventually kill her. Disease spread through the handmaiden quarters like wildfire. The priests didn't care as long as the girls could still function. Nefret watched as handmaidens developed mysterious fevers, painful sores, chronic infections. The temple physician would isolate them temporarily, dose them with harsh medicines, and send them back to work before they were healed. The worshippers never knew they were communing with the goddess through girls who were actively dying. The hierarchy among the handmaidens was cruel and necessary. Newer girls were given the most demanding assignments: the violent men, the all-night sessions, the group encounters. As you survived longer, you gained slightly better treatment. Fewer daily sessions, access to better medicine, marginally more comfortable sleeping quarters. This created a perverse incentive structure where older handmaidens actually supported the system that was killing them because it meant their own suffering decreased incrementally. Nefret befriended a handmaiden named Mutamwiya who had been serving for 6 years. Mutamwiya explained the unspoken rules. Never refuse a worshipper, no matter how brutal. Never cry where the priests can see you. Never admit you're sick until you literally cannot stand. Save every scrap of value you can steal, because when you become too damaged to serve, you'll need something to trade for a quick death instead of a slow one. The stealing was systematic. Handmaidens would pocket coins, small jewelry, anything worshippers left behind. They would hide these treasures in cracks in the walls, in the hems of their garments, anywhere the priests wouldn't find them during inspections. This tiny accumulation of wealth was their only hope for any kind of future, though most knew they'd never live long enough to use it. At night, in the handmaiden quarters, the girls would whisper about escape. But escape was impossible. The temple was guarded constantly. Even if someone made it past the guards, where would they go? Their families had sold them. Egyptian society believed they were serving the goddess. Any handmaiden who fled and told the truth would be branded a blasphemer and executed. The priests had created a perfect trap. Some handmaidens went mad. Nefret watched as girls started talking to themselves, seeing things that weren't there, becoming violent or catatonic. The priests called this being touched too deeply by the divine. In reality, it was complete psychological breakdown from sustained trauma. These girls would disappear suddenly, and new handmaidens would take their places. The machine never stopped running. Nefret lasted 3 years in active service, 3 years of being used by thousands of men, 3 years of pain, disease, and psychological torture, 3 years of watching other girls arrive, break, and disappear. She learned to function by becoming someone else entirely, a performing shell that said the right prayers and made the right movements, while the real Nefret hid somewhere deep inside where the worshippers couldn't reach her. But bodies can only take so much damage before they stop functioning. And the temple had very specific plans for handmaidens who became too sick or too damaged to serve their primary purpose. Nefret noticed the signs before the priests did. Her monthly bleeding had stopped entirely, which initially seemed like a blessing until the fever started. Then came the sores that wouldn't heal, the pain that made walking difficult, the exhaustion that no amount of rest could cure. She tried to hide it, knowing what happened to handmaidens who became too sick to work. The temple physician Imhotep examined her with the cold assessment of someone evaluating broken equipment. He reported to the high priest that Nefret had contracted a wasting disease, likely from one of the foreign worshippers. She could no longer serve without risk of spreading the infection. The decision was immediate. She would be transferred to the purification house. The purification house was located in the deepest part of the temple complex, far from the public areas. Nefret and 3 other sick handmaidens were taken there in the middle of the night. The priestess Merit, who had supervised their original training, explained their new purpose with the same mechanical detachment she had shown years earlier. Handmaidens who were too damaged for regular service weren't simply killed. That would be wasteful. Instead, they were assigned to the purification rituals, ceremonies that even the regular worshippers didn't know existed. Certain men paid enormous sums for these special rites, rituals that supposedly cleansed them of serious sins, cured diseases, or granted particularly powerful blessings from the goddess. What these rituals actually involved was giving violent men access to girls who were already dying. The logic was brutally efficient. If a handmaiden was going to die anyway, she might as well generate revenue until the moment of death. The men who purchased these rituals were the ones too brutal, too diseased, or too perverse even for the regular temple services. They paid premium prices for girls who couldn't complain and wouldn't survive to tell anyone what happened. Nefret's first purification ritual happened within days of her transfer. The worshipper was an elderly nobleman who had contracted a disease that was eating away at his face. He believed that transferring his illness to a sacred vessel would cure him. The ritual involved acts so violent and degrading that even after years of temple service, Nefret found herself shocked by what humans were capable of doing to each other. When it was over, she was bleeding from multiple places and had new injuries on top of her existing ones. The temple physician cleaned her wounds with wine that burned like fire, applied a paste that did nothing to help, and sent her back to the purification house to recover enough for the next ritual. There was no pretense of care. She was a resource to be extracted until fully depleted. The other girls in the purification house were in various stages of dying. Mutamwiya, Nefret's friend from the handmaiden quarters, had been transferred 2 months earlier. She was barely recognizable now, skeletal, covered in sores, her eyes sunken and distant. She whispered to Nefret about the rituals, about the things done to them in the name of purification, about the girls who didn't survive their sessions. The deaths were frequent. At least once a week, a handmaiden would die during or immediately after a purification ritual. The priests would wrap the body in cheap linen and take it somewhere in the night. Nefret learned from the older girls that there was a pit beneath the temple, a mass grave where hundreds of handmaidens had been thrown over the decades. No prayers, no proper burial, no acknowledgement that these had been human beings. Some girls tried to speed their own deaths. Nefret watched as one handmaiden named Neferur hoarded the poppy extract meant for pain relief, taking it all at once one night. She simply didn't wake up the next morning. The priests were furious at the waste of potential revenue, not at the death itself. After that, the medicine was strictly controlled. Nefret survived in the purification house for 8 months. 8 months of increasingly brutal rituals with men who viewed her as less than human. 8 months of watching other girls die or go mad. 8 months of her body systematically shutting down from disease and trauma. By the end, she could barely walk. Her weight had dropped to almost nothing. The sores on her body had become infected, creating a smell that even the incense couldn't mask. The high priest finally decided she had been extracted of all possible value. Nefret was told she would undergo the final purification, a ceremony that would release her from earthly service and send her to join the goddess in the afterlife. The terminology was poetic. The reality was execution. The ceremony took place in a chamber Nefret had never seen before, deep in the temple's underground section. Several other handmaidens who had been deemed used up were there as well, all in similar states of advanced decay. The high priest explained that they would drink a sacred elixir that would ease their passage to the afterlife. The elixir was poison, probably hemlock mixed with opium to make it less obviously painful. But before the poison was administered, there was one final ritual. A wealthy merchant had paid an extraordinary sum for the privilege of being present at the final purification, of being the last to commune with vessels before they joined the goddess. This was the ultimate perversion of their system. Men paying to rape girls during their execution. Nefret was too weak to fight, too broken to care anymore. She took the cup of poison after the final ritual was complete, grateful that it would finally be over. The last thing she heard before the darkness came was the high priest thanking the goddess for the service of her vessel. Around her, the other dying handmaidens were drinking their own poison, and somewhere in the distance, she could hear the sounds of new girls being brought to the temple, the next generation of victims for the machine. The story of Nefret and thousands like her remained buried for over 3,000 years. The Temple of Isis in Thebes continued operating for centuries, consuming countless girls in its systematic abuse. The priests kept meticulous records of revenue and inventory, but the handmaidens themselves were never named in official documents. They were just numbered vessels, interchangeable parts in a religious prostitution machine. The truth began emerging in 1897 when French archaeologist Victor Loret was excavating in the Valley of the Kings. While exploring a collapsed chamber beneath what had been identified as a temple complex, his workers broke through into an underground cavern. What they found inside would shock the archaeological community and reveal the darkest secret of ancient Egyptian religious practice. The cavern was a mass grave containing the remains of at least 847 individuals, all female, most between the ages of 8 and 25. The bodies had been thrown into the pit without ceremony, many still wrapped in the cheap linen shrouds used for the lowest classes. Unlike proper Egyptian burials, there were no grave goods, no canopic jars, no preparation for the afterlife. These people had been disposed of like refuse. The initial analysis was confusing. Why would so many young women be buried together in an unmarked mass grave beneath a temple? The first theories suggested plague victims, or perhaps a massacre. But as forensic examination continued, a much more disturbing picture emerged. The skeletal remains told a story of systematic brutality. Nearly every skeleton showed evidence of healed fractures, particularly in the ribs, arms, and facial bones. The pelvic bones of most specimens showed damage consistent with repeated trauma and childbirth at very young ages. Many skulls had depression fractures that had healed, suggesting blunt force trauma that the victims had survived. But it was the analysis of the teeth and bones that provided the most damning evidence. Isotope analysis revealed that most of these women had not grown up in Thebes. They had come from all over Egypt, brought to the temple as children. The wear patterns on their teeth suggested years of poor nutrition despite living in a wealthy temple complex. They had been fed just enough to survive, but not enough to thrive. Dr. Elisabeth Wiedemann, a German specialist in ancient diseases, examined the remains in 1903 and identified evidence of venereal diseases in over 60% of the specimens. Some showed signs of advanced syphilis, others showed bone changes consistent with chronic gonorrhea. These were diseases that spread through sexual contact, and the prevalence was far higher than in normal Egyptian populations. The most disturbing discovery came when researchers found a sealed chamber adjacent to the mass grave. Inside were papyrus scrolls detailing the temple's financial records. The documents described a systematic operation where handmaidens of Isis were used in sacred union rituals with worshippers. The revenue figures were staggering. The temple had generated wealth equivalent to millions of modern dollars by selling access to these girls. One particular scroll, dated to the reign of Rameses III, contained what appeared to be operational guidelines for the handmaiden program. It specified the ideal age for acquisition, methods for training and conditioning, pricing structures for different types of rituals, and disposal procedures for handmaidens who were no longer useful. The document was written in the dry, bureaucratic language of business accounting, discussing the rape and murder of children with the same tone used for grain inventory. Archaeological evidence revealed that the practice had been going on for at least 400 years. The layers of bodies in the mass grave showed continuous deposition over centuries. Thousands of girls had been fed into this machine, used until they broke, then thrown into the pit to make room for the next generation. The scale of the abuse was industrial. Modern forensic analysis of the remains in the 1990s using new technologies revealed even more horror. DNA testing showed that many of the women had been pregnant multiple times, though few remains of infants were found in the grave. This suggested forced abortions or infanticide, babies disposed of separately to keep the handmaidens working. Some skeletons showed evidence of crude surgical interventions, attempts to repair damage that had made the women unusable for their primary purpose. The final excavation of the site in 2003 uncovered the disposal chamber where the bodies were prepared before being thrown into the pit. Researchers found evidence of quicklime, used to accelerate decomposition and reduce the smell. They found remnants of the cheap linen shrouds, woven in a pattern specific to the lowest classes. They found fragments of rope that had been used to drag bodies, scoring marks on the stone floor where corpses had been pulled to their final disposal. But perhaps the most haunting discovery was a collection of small objects found scattered in the grave. Prayer beads, tiny figurines of Isis, fragments of amulets. The handmaidens had been buried with sacred objects, suggesting that even at the end, some still believed their suffering had religious meaning. They had been so thoroughly conditioned by the system that they died clutching symbols of the goddess who had allowed their destruction. The Temple of Isis in Thebes closed sometime in the 4th century CE as Christianity spread through Egypt. The priests destroyed most records, sealed the underground chambers, and tried to erase evidence of what had happened. But they couldn't destroy the mass grave, couldn't remove the bones, couldn't erase the physical evidence of their crimes. Modern Egypt struggled with how to present these findings. The tourist industry depended on romanticized images of ancient Egyptian religion. The truth about temple prostitution and child sexual abuse didn't fit the narrative of a wise, advanced civilization. For decades, the site was downplayed in official descriptions. The mass grave explained away as a burial place for lower-class temple workers. But the evidence was undeniable. The Temple of Isis had operated a systematic sexual exploitation network that consumed thousands of girls over centuries. The priests had created theological justifications for rape, developed efficient procedures for breaking and conditioning victims, and established a profitable business model based on human suffering. And they had done it all in the name of the divine. The last excavation report, published in 2011, included dental analysis that reconstructed the approximate ages of death. The average handmaiden in the mass grave had died between 18 and 22 years old. Given that most were acquired between 7 and 10 years old, they had survived an average of 10 to 12 years of service before their bodies completely broke down. Childhood, adolescence, and young adulthood all consumed by the machine. Nefret's individual story is unknown. Somewhere in that mass grave of 847 bodies lies her skeleton, marked by the same trauma, disease, and violence visible in all the others. She left no name in the archaeological record, no personal items to identify her, no voice beyond what the bones themselves could tell. She was one of thousands of girls whose lives were destroyed so wealthy men could convince themselves they were communing with the divine. The mass grave remains largely unexcavated. The Egyptian government has sealed the site, citing religious sensitivity and respect for the dead. But the real reason is shame. The revelation that ancient Egyptian religion included systematic child sexual abuse and religious prostitution on an industrial scale doesn't fit the carefully crafted image of a mystical, enlightened civilization. So the bodies stay in the ground, and tourists continue visiting sanitized versions of temples, never learning what actually happened in those underground chambers. The priests of Isis believed they had created a perfect system. They had theology to justify abuse, economic incentives to perpetuate it, and social structures to conceal it. They had transformed rape into ritual, slavery into religious service, murder into divine release. And they had gotten away with it for centuries. But in the end, the bones told the truth. The fractured skulls, the damaged pelvic bones, the evidence of disease and malnutrition, the sheer number of young women thrown into that pit, all testified to what had really happened. The priests could destroy papyrus, seal chambers, and erase names. But they couldn't destroy the physical evidence of what they had done. Nefret died believing she had served the goddess. The truth was that she had been sacrificed to human cruelty disguised as religion, to greed dressed up as devotion, to the perverse logic that allowed powerful men to destroy the powerless and call it sacred. Her short life ended in a pit beneath the temple, her body thrown on top of hundreds of others who had suffered the same fate, all of them victims of a system that turned children into commodities and called it worship. The Temple of Isis stood for centuries as a monument to faith. Its ruins now stand as a monument to what humans are capable of doing to each other when power is absolute, when victims have no voice, and when atrocity can hide behind the mask of the divine.